Michael Behe, I am so glad to meet you, and thank you for agreeing to do this. This is one of the rare times when I have actually initiated a Blogging Heads pairing, and it's because I just read your book, The Edge of Evolution, from 2007, and I found it absolutely shattering. I mean, this is a very important book, and yet I sense from the reputation or the reception of your book from 10 plus years ago, Darwin's Black Box, that it may be hard to get a lot of people to understand why the book is so important. So I just wanted to go back and forth with you for a little while to get a sense of what your intent with this book was and ask you a few questions and just allow this book to have the wide airing that it deserves. So thank you.
Yeah, sure. Sounds great to me. It's nice to be with you. I've never been on a Blogging Heads before, so should be fun.
Yeah, it's I want to start with this, and this is what motivates me. Darwin is great. I've always been really interested in evolution. Usually on Blogging Heads I talk about race issues, but however, actually in my actual daily life I'm interested much more in certain other things, such as I'm a massive dinosaur fan and things like that. And evolution has always fascinated me, but I've always seen a certain kink in the whole natural selection argument. And I've always asked people this basic question. It's about skunks. So if the idea is that there is this random mutation, and that certain random mutations end up spreading throughout a population because they convey some sort of fitness, then you have to go step by step by step. And this is something that I learned in particular from your book, Darwin's Black Box, that all these things have to happen incrementally. And I always thought to myself, with the skunk has this gland and this procedure where it shoots out this mist or this fluid that, makes things run away. Okay, but what were the intermediate steps? Presumably there was some weasel-like creature that did not have that ability. And it's easy to see how evolutionarily it would be advantageous to have that gland and to be able to squirt it at people. But what were the intermediate steps? How was it that there was some sort of proto-skunk where presumably it produced some tiny amount of malodorous chemical in its sweat in that part, and maybe just a hint of muscular tissue, and somehow this non-functioning proto-version of the scent squirter somehow helped that thing to propagate? What are the intermediate steps? And I always ask people this, and people start screaming at me that I'm implying that evolution is not responsible and that instead we're talking about God. And the whole discussion just gets derailed. Nevertheless, I think that it's a genuine question, and it's one that your book has me interested in examining further. So what is the basic premise of the edge of evolution? What do you mean by the edge of evolution?
Well, the edge of evolution is meant to imply what Darwinian processes can do and what they might not be able to do. I mean, I think it's clear. I certainly think that Darwinian processes can explain a lot of things like antibiotic resistance and maybe even, say, the white fur of a polar bear and things like that. I think most people would agree with that. But there are many things like the scent gland of a skunk where you don't know if this random change plus natural selection process is going to be able to cut the mustard, so to speak. And so the point of the edge of evolution is, well, do we have any data, do we have any studies that will actually help us to decide what Darwinism can do and what it can't do? And I kind of dubbed that the edge of evolution.
Exactly. And one of the basic premises of the book, and I want to get these premises out of the way first before we get to the question part, is that the Darwinian idea that there's common descent, that all the world's creatures have evolutionary relationships and develop from one another in some way, is clear, but that the problem is the notion that we have the difference between a skunk and an okapi and a tyrannosaurus, all based on random mutation, that random mutation could have created things like this. And go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say that's exactly right. Most people don't realize it, but Darwin's claim to fame wasn't just to suggest evolution in the sense of plain old common descent. His addition was the idea that this could happen completely without any mind or any guidance behind it. No plan, no design, nothing. Random mutation plus natural selection. so that things kind of so that life forms would just kind of blow with the wind in a sense. Nothing directional. Before Darwin, there were other scientists like, say, Lamarck, who postulated common descent, but they thought there was some teleology behind it, or some guidance, or some such thing. So the problem with Darwin's theory for many people, certainly myself, is that its mechanism, random mutation plus natural selection, just doesn't seem like it can get the job done.
Right, and one of the most interesting arguments in your book, and it bore careful reading, was that you can look at, say, malaria, how the malaria parasite has evolved, and malaria basically can beat our antidotes like chloroquine if there are many, 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 many generations, many, many more generations than there can possibly have been for the evolution, say, of mammals, because these organisms are so numerous. And the way it does this is with two mutations that happen at the same time, correct me if I'm wrong, and the chances of that happening are so infinitesimal and take so many generations, and that's about all that you can see when we actually watch organisms undergoing random mutation, rather than these magnificent things such as giraffes or even new protein combinations emerging. So your idea is that when we actually try to see random mutation happening, we don't really see very much. Is that a correct interpretation?
Yeah, that's right. The big problem with Darwin's theory and evolution in general was that, it was supposed to take so long, and so there were supposed to require so many generations of organisms and so many numbers of organisms that we wouldn't be able to see it within our lifetime, or even within recorded history. But in the past 20, 30 years, a lot of scientists have become interested in trying to do evolutionary studies on microorganisms, which you can grow in your laboratory in enormous numbers, or interested in microorganisms in nature, of which there are vastly more than, say, the large animals that we're used to thinking about that ever existed in history. So a fair test of evolution, instead of requiring large amounts of time, is to use large numbers of organisms like malaria, which is a little single-celled creature which causes sickness in humans, and see what they're able to do in tens of thousands of generations. And if they can't do very much, then we can easily say that, well, we won't be able to do more than that with fewer organisms, such as large animals, such as humans or skunks or dinosaurs or whatever. Something else must be causing those changes.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that every 10 minutes, there seems to be a book that comes out that you find in the science section at the store that purports to show that the sorts of questions that you're raising have been answered, that we've got it all figured out, how you get from an amoeba to Tom DeLay, that we understand this. And so there's like Sean Carroll's book, but Endless Forms Most Beautiful, and then there's the one by the two guys whose name I forget. One of them's named Mark, The Plausibility of Life. Yes. These books always seem to purport to show how these sorts of things actually work. And what they'll show is that there is a gene or a set of genes that program for body segments or program for body parts, and that if you alter one of these genes, then you can make a leg grow out of something's head or something like that. And I have always waited for those books to prove to me that everything's been figured out. And I don't go into them skeptically, but they never really quite explain how you get from the amoeba to the triceratops. Why would you say that they don't? How come those books don't cinch the case?
Well, frankly, because it's we don't know. They think you have to separate our knowledge of how life works, of which we've learned an enormous amount in the past 50 years, learned about DNA and genes and other things, from the question of how life originated or how life changed over time. We know very, very little of that, and a lot of people, including many good scientists like Carroll and Kirshner and others, get confused. They think because they see a couple of different organisms that have similarities, then they can imagine it in their heads, moving some things around, and it wouldn't be any problem whatsoever. But they confuse what's going on in their own heads with what's going on in nature. And I think that's what's important about the edge of evolution, is because it really brings to the table data that's accumulated in the past decade or so about what random mutation and natural selection can actually do out in the wild, in nature. And as I write in the book, it's pretty small. As you alluded to, malaria, which is the major case that I look at in the book, grows in enormous numbers in the world. There are, in one infected person with malaria, there are about 1 trillion little organisms swimming around.